Gabriel García Márquez. A very old man with enormous wings. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Rain had been falling for 3 days, and they had scarcely managed to kill all the crabs that entered the house. Pelayo had to cross his drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea. The newborn child had a fever all night, and they thought it was due to the stench. The sky and sea had become a single ash-grey blur, and the beach, which had been sparkling with March sun, had become a mush of rotting shellfish and crabs. Even at noon, the light was so faint that Pelayo could not make out what it was that was moaning and fluttering in the far corner of the courtyard. Only when he got close did he discover that it was an old man who was prostrate in the mud, trying to get up, but was hindered by his enormous wings. Frightened by the apparition, Pelayo ran to get his wife, Elisenda, who was putting compresses on the sick child. They both stood in silent amazement, staring at the creature prostrate in the mud. He was dressed in rags. A few strands of colorless hair clung to his bald skull. He had hardly any teeth, and his whole appearance lacked any grandeur. His enormous, buzzard-like wings, half plucked, were mired in the impenetrable mud of the courtyard. Pelayo and Elisenda observed him for so long and so carefully that they finally grew accustomed to his strange appearance. He almost seemed familiar to them. Then, emboldened, they spoke to him, and he answered in an incomprehensible dialect with the reedy voice of a sailor. Without much thought, immediately forgetting his strange wings, they decided he must be a survivor from some foreign shipwreck that had been caught in the storm. Even so, they called for the neighbor woman, who knew everything about life and death, just in case, and with a single glance, she dispelled their suppositions. "He's an angel," she told them. "He must have been sent for the child, but the poor thing is so old that he couldn't stand the rain and fell to the ground." Soon everyone knew that Pelayo had captured a real angel. No one dared to kill him, although the all-knowing neighbor woman claimed that modern angels were nothing more than participants in an ancient conspiracy against God who had managed to escape divine punishment and hide on earth. For the rest of the day, Pelayo watched him from the kitchen window, a rope in his hand just in case, and in the evening, he dragged the angel out of the mud and locked him in the chicken coop with the hens. At midnight, when the rain stopped, Pelayo and Elisenda were still fighting crabs. A little later, the child woke up and asked for food. His fever had completely gone. Then they felt a surge of generosity and decided between themselves that they would build a raft for the angel, give him fresh water and 3 days' worth of food, and set him adrift. But when they went out to the courtyard at dawn, they saw almost all the villagers there, crowded in front of the chicken coop, staring at the angel without any reverence and poking bits of bread through the wire mesh, as if he were a zoo animal, not a heavenly creature. By 7 o'clock, Father Gonzaga arrived, troubled by the unusual news. By then, a more respectable crowd had gathered around the chicken coop. Everyone was discussing the captive's future. The simple-minded believed he would be appointed mayor of the world. The more sensible ones supposed he was destined to become a general who would win all wars. Some fantasists advised keeping him as a sire to breed a new race of winged and wise humans who would bring order to the universe. Father Gonzaga had been a woodcutter before becoming a priest. Approaching the wire mesh, he quickly recalled everything he knew from the catechism and then asked for the chicken coop door to be opened so he could get a closer look at this scrawny male, who, surrounded by dumbfounded chickens, resembled a huge helpless bird himself. He was sitting in a corner, his outstretched wings catching the sun, amidst the droppings and remnants of the breakfast he had been given at dawn. Indifferent to what was happening, he barely raised his eyes, as if covered with cobwebs, and mumbled something in his dialect when Father Gonzaga entered the chicken coop and greeted him in Latin. The parish priest suspected something was wrong when he saw that this creature did not understand the language of the Lord God and was not trained to honor his servants. Observing him carefully, he discovered that this supposed angel was too much like a human. He exuded an unbearable smell of vagrancy, his wings were infested with parasites, his large feathers were tattered by earthly winds, and in general, nothing in his beggarly appearance corresponded to the high angelic rank. Father Gonzaga left the chicken coop and addressed his parishioners with a brief sermon on the dangers of credulity. He reminded them that the devil has a bad habit of wearing disguises to mislead the simple-minded. In conclusion, the priest justly remarked that if wings are not an essential element for distinguishing between a hawk and an airplane, they are even less so for recognizing angels. Nevertheless, he promised to write a letter to the bishop, so that he could write a letter to the primate, who in turn would write to the Pope, so that a final verdict would come from the highest authority. His appeal for caution fell on barren ground. News of the captive angel spread so quickly that within a few hours the courtyard had turned into a marketplace, and troops had to be called in to disperse the crowd with bayonets, as they could have torn the house down at any moment. Elisenda's back ached from constantly cleaning up the mess, and a good idea occurred to her, to fence off the courtyard and charge 5 centavos for admission to see the angel. People came all the way from Martinique. One time, a traveling circus arrived with a flying acrobat who buzzed over the crowd several times, but no one paid any attention to him because he had the wings of a starry bat, not an angel. Desperate sick people arrived from all over the Caribbean coast in search of a cure. A miserable woman who had been counting her heartbeats since childhood and had already lost count. A Jamaican martyr who could not sleep because the noise of the stars tormented him. A sleepwalker who got up every night to destroy what he had built during the day, and others with less dangerous ailments. In the midst of this commotion, which made the earth tremble, Pelayo and Elisenda, though endlessly tired, were happy. In less than a week, they had stuffed their mattresses with money, and the line of pilgrims waiting their turn to see the angel stretched out, disappearing beyond the horizon. The angel was very displeased with all of this. Driven to despair by the infernal heat of the lamps and candles that the pilgrims left at the entrance to his dwelling, his only occupation was to find comfortable spots in the chicken coop. At first, they tried to feed him camphor crystals, which, according to the learned neighbor woman, were the main food of angels. But he refused them, just as he continued to refuse the appetizing breakfasts the pilgrims brought him. No one knew whether it was because he was truly an angel, or simply due to old age. He only ate eggplant puree. It seemed his only supernatural quality was patience, especially in the early days, when the chickens pecked at him, hunting for the stellar parasites that had multiplied in his wings, and when the cripples plucked his feathers to apply to their wounds, and the less pious threw stones at him to make him stand up so they could get a better look. Only once was he provoked. They branded his side with a red-hot iron, like they brand calves. He had lain motionless for so long that people thought he had died. He started, jumped up, shouting something in his incomprehensible language, with eyes full of tears, and flapped his wings several times, raising clouds of chicken droppings and moon dust, and a sudden, chilling gust of wind seemed like the breath of the other world. Although many believed it was merely a normal reaction to pain, not anger, after this incident, they tried not to disturb him, for everyone understood that his tranquility was the calm of a subsiding hurricane, not the passivity of a retired seraph. While awaiting the highest interpretation of the prisoner's nature, Father Gonzaga unsuccessfully tried to reason with his fickle flock on the spot. But apparently in Rome, they had no concept of urgency. Time was spent determining if the visitor had a navel, if anything similar to Aramaic was found in his language, how many like him could fit on the head of a pin, and if he wasn't simply a Norwegian with wings. The exhaustive letters would probably have gone back and forth until the end of time, if one day Providence had not put an end to the parish priest's torment. It so happened that in those days, one of the many carnival attractions wandering the Caribbean coast arrived in town. It was a sad spectacle, a woman transformed into a spider for once disobeying her parents. It cost less to see the spider-woman than to see the angel, and furthermore, one was allowed to ask her any questions about her strange appearance, to examine her this way and that, so that no one would have any doubts about the truth of the sacred punishment that had occurred. She was a repulsive tarantula the size of a lamb with the head of a sad maiden. People were amazed not so much by the appearance of this spawn of hell, as by the sorrowful truthfulness with which the spider-woman recounted the details of her misfortune. As a girl, she had once run away from home to a dance against her parents' will, and when, having danced all night, she was returning home along a forest path, a terrible clap of thunder split the sky in two, a dazzling lightning bolt shot from the abyss into the opening, transforming the girl into a spider. Her only food was lumps of minced meat that kind people sometimes threw into her mouth. Such a miracle, an embodiment of earthly truth and God's judgment, naturally had to eclipse the haughty angel, who hardly deigned to look at mere mortals. Furthermore, the few miracles attributed to him by popular rumor suggested some intellectual deficiency. A blind old man who came from afar seeking a cure did not regain his sight, but grew 3 new teeth. A paralytic never got back on his feet, but almost won the lottery, and sunflowers sprouted from a leper's sores. All this seemed more like mockery than holy deeds, and thoroughly damaged the angel's reputation, and the spider-woman's appearance completely erased it. It was then that Father Gonzaga was forever cured of his insomnia, and Pelayo's patio became as deserted again as in the days when it rained for 3 days straight and crabs roamed the rooms. The homeowners did not complain about their fate. With the money they had earned, they built a spacious 2-story house with a balcony and a garden, on a high foundation so crabs wouldn't crawl in during winter, and with iron bars on the windows so angels wouldn't fly in. Pelayo started a rabbit breeding farm near the town and permanently gave up his position as constable, while Elisenda bought herself high-heeled patent leather shoes and many dresses of iridescent silk that, in those days, the most distinguished ladies wore on Sundays. The chicken coop was the only place on the property that received no attention. If it was sometimes washed or had myrrh burned inside, it was by no means to please the angel, but to somehow combat the stench emanating from it, which, like an evil spirit, permeated every corner of the new house. At first, when the child learned to walk, they made sure he didn't get too close to the chicken coop. But gradually, they got used to the smell, and all their fears passed. So, even before the boy's baby teeth started to fall out, he would freely climb into the chicken coop through holes in the deteriorated wire mesh. The angel was as unwelcoming to him as to other mortals, but he endured all the cruel childish antics with dog-like submission. They both got chickenpox at the same time. The doctor treating the child could not resist the temptation to examine the angel and found that he had a very bad heart and his kidneys were no good. It was amazing how he was still alive. However, what surprised the doctor most was the structure of his wings. They seemed so natural in this absolutely human organism that it remained a mystery why other people did not have such wings. By the time the boy went to school, the sun and rain had completely destroyed the chicken coop. The liberated angel wandered back and forth, like an exhausted sleepwalker. No sooner was he swept out of the bedroom than he was underfoot in the kitchen. It seemed he could be in several places at once. The owners suspected he was duplicating himself, reappearing in different corners of the house, and a desperate Elisenda would shout that it was true torture to live in this hell, teeming with angels. The angel was so weak he could barely eat. His eyes, clouded with a film, could no longer distinguish anything, and he stumbled along, bumping into objects. Only a few stubby feathers remained on his wings. Pelayo, feeling sorry for him, wrapped him in a blanket and took him to sleep under the shed, and only then did they notice that at night he had a fever and was delirious, like that old Norwegian whom local fishermen had once picked up on the seashore. Pelayo and Elisenda were genuinely alarmed. Even the wise neighbor woman couldn't tell them what to do with dead angels. But the angel had no intention of dying. He survived his most difficult winter, and with the first sun, he began to recover. For several days he sat motionless in the patio, hidden from prying eyes, and in early December, his eyes brightened, regaining their former glassy transparency. Large, sturdy feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of an old bird that seemed to be planning to don a new shroud. The angel himself evidently knew the reason for all these changes, but he carefully hid them from others. Sometimes, thinking no one could hear him, he quietly hummed sailor songs under the stars. One morning, Elisenda was chopping onions for breakfast when a wind, like one from the sea, suddenly swept into the kitchen. The woman looked out the window and witnessed the angel's last moments on earth. He was preparing for flight in an awkward, clumsy way, moving in ungainly leaps. He furrowed the entire garden with his sharp claws and nearly demolished the shed with the dull gleam of his wings. Finally, he managed to gain altitude. Elisenda sighed with relief, for herself and for him, watching him fly over the last houses of the village, barely grazing the rooftops and vigorously flapping his enormous, old hawk-like wings. Elisenda watched him until she finished chopping the onions and until the angel had completely vanished from sight, and he was no longer a nuisance in her life, but simply an imaginary dot on the sea horizon.